Welcome to Mr. Crimeshow. In this episode, I've put together 8 disturbing true crime cases, each filled with chilling twists and unsettling details. With rain softly falling in the background and a black screen to set the mood, this compilation is perfect for night listening, whether you want to relax, unwind, or fall asleep to true crime. If you like our work, remember to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The darkness within a family, the life and loss of Ella Bennett. Charity Bennett believed in second chances. She had rebuilt her entire life from the ashes of trauma, addiction, and loss, determined to break the cycle of violence that had shadowed her family for decades. But on a cold February night in 2007, in a quiet house in Abilene, Texas, her faith in healing would be shattered by an unthinkable betrayal. Her 4-year-old daughter, Ella, would lose her life due to the actions of someone who should have protected her above all else. Her own brother. The Bennett family story began decades earlier, rooted in a darkness that seemed to follow them through generations. In 1980, when Charity was just 6 years old, her father, James Robert Bennett, Jr., was found no longer alive in their Georgia home after sustaining multiple injuries. Her mother, Kyla Clark Bennett, became the prime suspect after investigators discovered she had been placed back on James's, just 3 days after their remarriage in Las Vegas. Despite allegations that she had paid $50,000 to have him eliminated, Kyla was acquitted after an 11-day trial. The truth would forever remain a shadow over the family. Growing up as the daughter of an accused individual left deep scars on young Charity. Classmates would taunt her, saying, "I hear your mommy hurt your daddy." While at home, her mother fell into a lifestyle of drinking and neglect, leaving no time for her grieving daughter. The pressure of carrying this burden led Charity to struggle with addiction for 4 years, desperately seeking attention and love from a mother who seemed incapable of providing either. But Charity was determined to be different. At 18, she fought her way to sobriety, earned a degree in family development psychology, and poured all her energy into becoming the mother she never had. When Paris Lee Bennett was born in 1993, she saw him as her chance at redemption, her opportunity to break the cycle of tragedy that had defined her childhood. Paris was extraordinary from the beginning. With an IQ of 141, he excelled in school and was adored by teachers and classmates alike. To Charity, he was the perfect child, and together they formed what seemed like the perfect family. The bond between mother and son was unbreakable, forged through years of just the two of them against the world. Paris's father had suffered a severe psychological breakdown before his birth, leaving Charity to raise her gifted son alone. When Ella was born on April 12, 2002, Charity watched nervously as Paris held his baby sister for the first time. "I remember putting Ella in his arms," she would later recall. "He was looking down at her, and I was waiting to see what the reaction was going to be. He had this huge smile on his face and said, 'Oh, Mama, she's beautiful.'" The differences between the siblings became apparent as they grew. Ella was vibrant, spunky, and social, the kind of child who could light up an entire room with her presence. She dreamed of being a singer and always spoke whatever was on her mind, bringing life to everyone around her. Paris, meanwhile, was quiet and introverted, preferring reading and drawing to social activities. Yet he seemed to embrace his role as big brother beautifully, becoming inseparable from his little sister. Ella absolutely adored Paris, Charity remembered. Anything Paris did, Ella had to do. Paris would pick her clothes out every day. He was her fashion consultant, she said. The two would play together constantly, with Paris creating silly news reports from Ella's ball pit and documenting their adventures with the devotion of a loving older brother. As a single mother working 2 jobs at restaurants just to make ends meet, Charity relied heavily on Paris to help care for Ella. The pressure was enormous, but her goal remained unwavering: to give both children the stable, loving home she had never known. Even with her demanding work schedule, she dedicated every free moment to Paris and Ella, believing that love and attention could overcome any obstacle. February 4, 2007, began like any other Super Bowl Sunday. The sports bar where Charity worked was preparing for one of the busiest nights of the year, and she was scheduled for a double shift to handle the crowds. She hired a babysitter to watch 13-year-old Paris and 4-year-old Ella, kissed them goodbye, and left for work with no indication that this would be the last normal moment her family would ever share. The evening progressed normally until around midnight, when police officers walked into the bar asking for Charity by name. "They told me that my daughter had been hurt," she later recalled. "And I was like, you need to take me to Ella now." The officers' serious expressions and unsettling quietness sent chills down her spine as they escorted her home, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited. Her house was surrounded by caution tape, police vehicles, news trucks, and neighbors. The entire street was illuminated by emergency lights, and Charity knew immediately that something terrible had occurred. When she pleaded with officers to tell her what they seemed afraid to reveal, her world collapsed entirely. Ella was gone. She was in a bag, zipped up to her chin. There were visible signs she had been in distress, Charity remembered through tears. "I started screaming that I was sorry that I wasn't there. They took her away. And then I just remember collapsing. The sight of her baby girl being carried from their home was too much to bear." After watching Ella being taken away, Charity asked about Paris, learning he was already at the police station waiting for her. Relief flooded through her. At least one of her children had survived this nightmare. But as she rode to the station, something felt deeply wrong. There was a coldness in the air that reminded her uncomfortably of the tragedy that had torn apart her own childhood. The reunion with Paris in the police interrogation room revealed the first crack in what she thought she knew about her son. "When I saw him, the only thing I felt was so happy to see my child, because he was the only one left," she said. "I started hugging him and just crying, cried forever. And then I realized at some point that he wasn't hugging me back, and that's when everything stopped making sense." As investigators began piecing together the events of that evening, a disturbing picture emerged. Around 10:00 p.m., Paris had convinced the babysitter to leave early, claiming falsely that Charity was coming home sooner than expected and that he was responsible enough to care for Ella alone. Both statements were lies designed to get the babysitter out of the house. At 11:42 p.m., the 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from Paris, claiming he had discovered Ella unresponsive. On the recorded call, Paris appeared to be in shock, telling the operator he believed Ella was an inflamed, pumpkin-headed demon that he had defended himself against. When instructed to perform CPR, he seemed to comply, counting along with the dispatcher as she guided him through the procedure. But when officers arrived at the scene, they found Ella lying face down with no signs that anyone had actually performed CPR on her. Paris had been pretending the entire time, pacing around the room while his sister's condition worsened. He had never tried to save her. The truth was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. That night, sometime before 11:30 p.m., Paris had entered Ella's room and caused her severe harm, ultimately taking her life. Following the attack, he had called a school friend for about 6 minutes before deciding to contact 911, using those precious minutes to construct his full story. "I went to see him that night," Charity later revealed. "I was like, I don't believe you anymore. I think you took your sister's life on purpose." All of a sudden, he became a completely different person. It's like he no longer had to keep up this act anymore. He looked at me and he said, "Y'all are so stupid." He laughed at me. The boy who had seemed like the perfect child, the gifted student, beloved by teachers, had been hiding something dark and calculating beneath his quiet exterior. Looking back, Charity wondered if there had been signs she missed, moments when Paris's true nature might have shown through his carefully constructed facade. February 10th brought Ella's funeral, where nearly 200 people gathered at a local church to remember a vibrant little girl whose life had been cut short. Ella wanted to be a singer, someone said during the service. She was a pistol, and she always said what was ever on her mind. She just brought life into everybody. But even in this moment of grief, Some children whispered jokes during the service, a painful reminder of how deeply Ella's struggles had gone unnoticed. The community's reaction was swift and harsh. Many blamed Charity for raising what they saw as a monster, questioning everything from the books Paris read to the video games he played. I believe Charity got the brunt of that, because even if it's a book that he's reading, well, who got him the book? And even if it's a video game that he's playing, well, who allowed him to play that game? Recalled one observer. Charity took a lot of heat for her situation. People were very cruel to her. As the legal proceedings began, Charity faced an impossible situation. Paris could not be tried as an adult since the minimum age in Texas is 14, so the case proceeded in juvenile court. But for Charity, the courtroom became a place of torment where she had to choose between her children. When I would go talk to a district attorney, I had to be Ella's mother, she explained. When I went to talk to a defense attorney, I had to be Paris's mother. And if I tried to put Paris and Ella together in my brain, I really got close to insanity. During the proceedings, she literally sat in the middle of the courtroom because she couldn't choose sides between her two children. Psychological evaluations revealed the full extent of Paris's condition. I had a psychopath checklist youth version administered to Paris, Charity said. His assessor told me, "You deserve to know that your son is a sociopath." Further assessments documented significant psychopathic traits, and Paris admitted to having thoughts of harm since he was a young child. The motive for the attack was perhaps the most devastating revelation of all. Paris later admitted that his resentment toward his mother had driven him to take Ella's life, believing that the best way to emotionally devastate Charity was to take away one of her children. Shortly before the incident, Charity had relapsed into addiction, which investigators believed was Paris's breaking point. But this had been planned, calculated, and executed by a 13-year-old who saw his innocent sister as nothing more than a weapon to use against their mother. On August 15, 2007, Paris pleaded guilty to a capital offense in juvenile court and received the maximum sentence of 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. When he turned 19, he was transferred from juvenile detention to adult prison. During the sentencing, Charity made a promise that would define the rest of her relationship with her son. "I told him that I was always going to love him no matter what," she said. "And then I also promised him that I was always going to do the best job I could to be his mother." But she was clear about her intentions. After Paris took his sister's life, I was not trying to get Paris off. I wanted to get Paris help. The years following the trial brought new revelations about Paris's continuing dangerous behavior. In 2021, Charity made the difficult decision to cease all communication with her son after learning he had become involved with a woman who was facing charges for planning a mass shooting just 2 hours away from where Charity lived. "I finally accepted it is okay to love him as my son, but really dislike the man he has become," she stated. Experts have concluded that Paris is unlikely ever to be rehabilitated. He will first be eligible for parole in February 2027, and if never granted parole, he will be released in February 2047. Charity has been told that she and her family may be at risk once Paris is released, and she accepts that she will likely need to relocate when that time comes. From her pain, Charity has built something meaningful. "The night that Ella passed away, I made her a promise that something meaningful would come out of her passing," she explained. "So I set up the Ella Foundation to prevent violence by sharing our story." She has become an advocate for children's mental health rehabilitation, speaking about the importance of getting proper help for kids who might be heading down a dangerous path due to unmanaged mental illness. "I'm tired of the history repeating itself," Charity said. "I have been able to forgive Paris for the worst thing imaginable, but I'm never gonna be comfortable with it. In order to have my own sense of peace, to have integrity, it's time to stop the pattern." Through her advocacy work, she ensures that Ella's memory continues to offer hope to families facing similar traumas. "You're right that it will never bring Ella back, but it does keep Ella alive," Charity reflects. "I can't change Paris today, but maybe by doing this, I can help with changing somebody else's child. Her daughter's legacy has become a beacon for other families, proof that even in the darkest moments, love and forgiveness can create something meaningful from unimaginable loss. The Bennett family tragedy serves as a reminder of how violence can tear apart even the most loving homes, and how the survivors must find ways to honor those they've lost while protecting others from similar fates. Ella Bennett's brief life, filled with song and laughter, continues to inspire change in a world that too often fails to recognize the signs of danger hiding in plain sight. Through her mother's unwavering dedication to helping other families, Ella's spirit lives on, offering hope that no other child will suffer as she did, and no other mother will face the impossible choice between seeking justice for one child while loving another who took that child's life. The loss of Arlies Perry, a 44-year search for justice. Arlies K. Dykema was born on February 22, 1955, in Bismarck, North Dakota, where she grew up surrounded by a loving family who cherished her deeply. She was a young woman who took her faith seriously and carried with her a gentle spirit that drew people close. In her hometown, she met Bruce Duncan Perry, a fellow student who would become her high school sweetheart and eventually her husband. Their love story began in the familiar halls of their North Dakota school, where they shared dreams of a future together far beyond the plains where they grew up. Arlies was known to be thoughtful, caring, and devoted to her Christian beliefs. Those who knew her described her as someone who approached life with sincerity and kindness. She and Bruce built a relationship founded on mutual respect and shared values, planning a life together that seemed full of promise. When Bruce decided to pursue his pre-medical studies at Stanford University in California, Arlies made the decision to support his dreams by moving across the country with him. In August 1974, just 6 weeks before tragedy would strike, the newlyweds made the significant move from North Dakota to Palo Alto, California. Bruce had enrolled as a sophomore pre-medical student at Stanford University, and Arlies found work as a receptionist at a local law firm to help support them during his studies. The young couple settled into married life in Escondido Village, the university's housing for married students and families. For Arlies, the transition from small-town North Dakota to the bustling California campus environment was significant, but she embraced it as part of supporting her husband's education and their shared future. Their new life in California represented hope and possibility. Bruce was dedicated to his studies, working toward becoming a doctor, while Arlies found purpose in her work and in building their new home together. The Stanford campus, with its beautiful architecture and sprawling grounds, became their temporary world as they pursued Bruce's academic goals. During the weeks leading up to October 12, 1974, Arlies had been adjusting to life in California while maintaining the faith that had always been central to who she was. Stanford Memorial Church, with its magnificent architecture and peaceful atmosphere, had become a place where she could find solace and connect with her beliefs. The church's towering spires and ornate interior provided her with a familiar sense of spiritual comfort in an environment that was still new to her. October 12, 1974, began like many other days for the young couple, but it would end in unimaginable tragedy. That evening, around 11:30 p.m., Arlies and Bruce found themselves in a disagreement about something as simple as their car's tire pressure. The argument, though minor in nature, left both of them feeling frustrated. Such disagreements are common in any marriage, especially for young couples navigating the stresses of school, work, and life in a new place. Neither could have known how profoundly this moment would change everything. Seeking peace and wanting to clear her mind through prayer, Arlies told Bruce that she intended to visit Stanford Memorial Church alone. The church remained open late, and she often found comfort there when she needed time to reflect and pray. Bruce understood his wife's need for spiritual solace, though he likely wished their evening hadn't ended with tension between them. As Arlies walked toward the church that night, she carried with her the same gentle spirit and faith that had always defined her. When Arlies didn't return home by 3:00 a.m., Bruce's concern grew into genuine worry. This was unlike his wife, who was reliable and considerate about keeping him informed of her whereabouts. Knowing something was wrong, Bruce contacted Stanford police to report that Arlies was missing. The authorities responded by sending officers from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office to check Stanford Memorial Church, but they reported that all the outer doors appeared to be locked and secured. What the officers didn't know at the time was that Stephen Blake Crawford, a campus security guard and former Stanford police officer, had access to the church and had been inside that evening. Crawford had begun working for the Stanford Department of Public Safety in 1971, but had been reassigned to security duties the following year when a new police chief restructured the department. This change had left Crawford feeling bitter and resentful, according to those who knew him during that period. Crawford would later claim that he had locked up the church shortly after midnight, reporting that he noticed no unusual activity inside at that time. He also stated, though this was later found to be false, that he had returned around 2:00 a.m. to recheck the doors and found them still secured. These statements would become crucial elements of the investigation, though their accuracy would be questioned for decades to come. At approximately 5:45 a.m. on October 13, 1974, Crawford contacted police to report that he had discovered something alarming inside the church. When investigators arrived at Stanford Memorial Church, they found a scene that would haunt them for decades to come. Arlies had lost her life due to the actions of someone who had caused her great harm in ways that shocked even experienced investigators. She was found lying face up near the altar in the church's east transept, with her hands folded across her chest. An ice pick was found at the scene, and investigators noted marks suggesting attempts to cut off her breathing. They also discovered that parts of her clothing had been removed, and evidence showed she had been mistreated with candles from the church. Her jeans had been arranged across her legs in what appeared to be a deliberate diamond pattern. The scene suggested to investigators that whoever was responsible had spent considerable time inside the church and felt confident they would not be interrupted. The level of detail in how Arlies had been positioned, combined with the use of religious items from the church itself, created an atmosphere that deeply disturbed those who responded to the scene. "I could not believe what I was seeing," recalled Raerol Niemeyer, a retired captain with the Stanford Department of Public Safety. "I had a few homicides in my day, but I had never seen anything so eerie." The medical examiner determined that Arlies had lost her life around midnight due to the wound inflicted to the back of her head. There was no sign of forced entry to the building, and no evidence of a major struggle, which suggested she may have known her attacker or that the person responsible had legitimate access to the church. The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately frustrating for both law enforcement and Arlies' family. Investigators found evidence at the scene, including genetic material on a kneeling pillow near where Arlies was found, as well as a partial palm print on one of the candles. However, neither the genetic evidence nor the print matched Bruce Perry or Stephen Crawford using the testing methods available at the time. Bruce Perry naturally became an initial suspect, as husbands often are in cases involving their wives, but he was eventually ruled out through evidence and witness testimony. The fact that he had reported Arlies missing and had been genuinely concerned about her welfare worked in his favor, as did the timeline of events that evening. Crawford remained a person of interest throughout the investigation due to his access to the church and his role in discovering Arlies' remains, but there was insufficient evidence to charge him with any crime. For more than 4 decades, he lived under the shadow of suspicion while the case remained unsolved. During this time, he was repeatedly questioned by investigators as they pursued various leads and theories about what had happened that October night. The case took on additional notoriety when serial offender David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, made statements suggesting he had knowledge about the case. In letters, Berkowitz mentioned Arlies' situation and claimed to have heard details from someone he referred to as Manson II. Investigative reporter Maury Terry noted that Berkowitz had volunteered information about the case without being prompted, writing in 1979 about Arlys being hunted, stalked and slain, and followed to California. Terry's investigation uncovered a disturbing detail. Someone on the Stanford campus had taken a telephone listing under Bruce Perry's name, creating confusion when Arlys' best friend and Bruce's mother attempted to reach the couple. This led to Arlys herself calling the fraudulent number and speaking to someone in residence there. In a letter to her friend, dated September 27, 1974, just weeks before her passing, Arlys wrote about the strange coincidence of finding another Bruce Duncan Perry who attended Stanford University and had recently married, though his wife was not named Arlys. While these connections raised questions about whether Arlys might have been specifically targeted, investigators ultimately determined that Berkowitz had nothing of value to offer regarding the case. The supposed satanic connections and ritual aspects of the scene, while disturbing, did not lead to concrete evidence about who was responsible. For years, the case remained in the files of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, reviewed periodically but lacking the breakthrough that would bring justice. Arlys' family, including her sister Karen Barnes and their aging parents, waited for answers that seemed might never come. The passage of time was particularly painful for Arlys' father, who carried the burden of not knowing who had taken his daughter's life or why. The breakthrough finally came in 2016, when cold case investigators decided to re-examine the physical evidence using modern DNA analysis techniques. Lieutenant Rick Alanis, the lead detective in the Perry case, made a startling discovery while reviewing the stored evidence. The pants that had been labeled as belonging to Arlys were actually far too large to have fit her. They had belonged to her husband Bruce. When investigators located Arlys' actual clothing and sent it for advanced DNA analysis, the results would change everything. The genetic material found on Arlys' clothing matched DNA from Stephen Crawford, the security guard who had claimed to discover her remains. This evidence, combined with additional investigative work, finally provided the proof that had eluded investigators for more than 4 decades. After 44 years of uncertainty, science had provided the answer the family had been seeking. On June 28, 2018, detectives from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office arrived at Crawford's studio apartment on Camden Avenue in San Jose, California, with a search warrant. Crawford, now 72 years old, had been living quietly about 20 miles from Stanford University. When deputies announced their presence and attempted to serve the warrant, Crawford stalled them at the door, saying he needed to get dressed. What happened next brought the long investigation to a sudden and final conclusion. As deputies prepared to enter the apartment, they observed Crawford with a firearm and immediately backed away for their safety. A short time later, a gunshot was heard from inside the apartment. When deputies eventually entered the residence, they found that Crawford had taken his own life with what was described as a large revolver. No deputies discharged their weapons, and no one else was present or injured. During their search of Crawford's apartment following his passing, investigators made 2 significant discoveries that provided additional insight into the case. They found the jacket cover from a book titled The Ultimate Evil, which detailed Arlys Perry's case, and a suicide note believed to have been written approximately 2 years earlier, after Crawford had been interviewed by a sheriff's detective. These items suggested that Crawford had been contemplating his own demise for some time and was aware that investigators continued to consider him a suspect. Sheriff Laurie Smith, who had taken the case really personally over the years, expressed both satisfaction and frustration at the resolution. "It's been frustrating through the years that we could never get enough evidence to charge the suspect," Smith said. "It's difficult for her family and it's difficult for our department, but we finally have closure on this case." The news of Crawford's identification as the perpetrator and his subsequent passing brought mixed emotions to Arlys' family. Her sister, Karen Barnes, then 67 years old, told reporters that the resolution brought her closure, though she acknowledged that their 88-year-old mother struggled with understanding why someone would have harmed Arlies. "You know, Mom, I don't think we're ever going to know the why," Karen had told her mother. Tragically, Arlies' father had passed away just 3 months before Crawford was identified, never receiving the answers he had sought for more than 4 decades. His dying wish had been to know who had taken his daughter's life and why such a thing had happened to their family. The timing of his passing, so close to when justice was finally within reach, added another layer of sadness to an already heartbreaking situation. Bruce Perry, who had gone on to become a renowned psychiatrist and expert in trauma, expressed relief that the case had finally been resolved. For 44 years, he had lived with the knowledge that his wife's case remained unsolved, carrying both the grief of her loss and the weight of having been an initial suspect in the investigation. The identification of Crawford as the perpetrator finally cleared away any lingering questions about Bruce's involvement and allowed him to find some measure of peace. The resolution of Arlies Perry's case demonstrated the power of persistence in law enforcement and the advances in forensic science that have revolutionized cold case investigations. The DNA evidence that ultimately identified Crawford had been present at the scene in 1974, but the technology to analyze it properly didn't exist at that time. It was only through the dedication of cold case investigators and the development of more sophisticated testing methods that justice was finally possible. Stanford University, which had offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible for Arlies' passing, acknowledged the resolution of the case. Lisa Lapin, vice president for university communications, stated that the university extended gratitude to law enforcement for their decades of effort and noted that the case remains a heart-wrenching memory at the university. The loss of Arlies Perry represents not just the tragedy of a young life cut short, but also the enduring impact such events have on families, communities, and institutions. Her story became part of Stanford's history, a reminder of vulnerability even in places that should feel safe. For more than 4 decades, her case served as a symbol of justice delayed, hope maintained, and the determination of those who refuse to let victims be forgotten. Through all the years of investigation, legal proceedings, and public attention, Arlies remained at the center of a story that was ultimately about her. A 19-year-old woman who had moved across the country to support her husband's dreams, who found comfort in faith and prayer, and whose life was taken by someone who betrayed the trust placed in him to protect the campus community. Her memory deserves to be honored not for the circumstances of her passing, but for the person she was and the love she shared with those who knew her. The case that haunted a community for nearly 6 decades. March 18, 1964, began as a quiet morning in the small coal mining town of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. 9-year-old Marais Ann Chivrella woke early, ready to start another school day at St. Joseph's Parochial School. She had a special reason to be excited that morning. She was carrying canned goods to donate to her teacher, a nun who had requested them for charity. Marais was a devout child who attended Mass regularly and dreamed of becoming a nun herself one day. Her parents, Carmen and Mary Chivrella, had raised their large family with deep Catholic values in their close-knit community. The Chivrellas were a loving household where Marais was cherished alongside her 4 siblings, Ron, Bari, Carmen, Marie, and David. She was known throughout the neighborhood as a gentle, shy child who loved playing jump rope, learning the organ, and helping her family whenever she could. Those who knew her described her as sweet-natured and full of innocent curiosity about the world around her. That morning around 8:10 a.m., Marais kissed her parents goodbye and stepped out into the crisp March air, her school bag containing the donated canned goods slung over her shoulder. She walked the familiar route towards St. Joseph's, hoping to deliver the items to her teacher and still make it to morning Mass on time. It would be the last time her family would see their precious daughter alive. When Marais failed to arrive at school that morning, alarm bells began ringing throughout the community. Teachers contacted her parents, who immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Their daughter was responsible and punctual. She would never simply fail to show up without explanation. As word spread that a little girl was missing, neighbors joined the desperate search throughout Hazleton streets and surrounding areas. The nightmare became reality that afternoon when a man giving his 16-year-old nephew driving lessons made a heartbreaking discovery in a coal refuse pit near the town. What they initially thought was a large doll lying in the waste area turned out to be Marais' small form. The uncle and nephew immediately contacted authorities, and within hours, the devastating news reached the Chivrella family. Investigators who arrived at the scene quickly determined that Marais had been attacked before losing her life due to strangulation. Evidence collected from her clothing would later prove crucial, though it would take nearly 6 decades before technology could unlock its secrets. The community of Hazleton was shaken to its core. Nothing like this had ever happened in their peaceful town, and parents suddenly found themselves looking at their own children with new fears. The investigation that followed consumed the Pennsylvania State Police for generations. Since the department's establishment in 1905, they would spend more than half their history working on this single case. More than 230 officers would eventually contribute to the investigation over the years, each one hoping to be the person who finally brought justice for Marais and closure for her grieving family. Detective after detective followed lead after lead, interviewing hundreds of people, examining evidence, and pursuing every possible connection. They spoke to neighbors, schoolmates, teachers, and anyone who might have seen something suspicious that March morning. But despite their tireless efforts, the case remained frustratingly cold. Whoever had taken Marais' life had seemingly vanished without leaving any traceable evidence behind. For the Chivrella family, the years that followed were marked by unimaginable grief mixed with a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually find answers. Carmen and Mary Chivrella raised their remaining children while carrying the constant weight of not knowing who had taken their youngest daughter from them. Every Sunday and holiday, Mary would end her prayers with the same plea: "Please help the Pennsylvania State Police find the man who hurt my daughter." The case haunted the entire community. Lieutenant Devon Brutowski would later observe that what happened to Marais ushered in a fundamental change in Hazleton. "Whether you like it or not, the way you lived changed after March 18 of 1964, he said, reflecting on how the crime shattered the town's sense of security and innocence. Parents became more protective, children were warned about strangers, and an invisible cloud of fear settled over what had once been a carefree community. Years turned into decades. The original investigators retired, but new ones took their places, each determined to solve the case that had become synonymous with Pennsylvania's most persistent mysteries. Evidence was re-examined countless times, witnesses were re-interviewed, and new technologies were applied as they became available. Still, the identity of Marais' attacker remained unknown. The breakthrough finally came in 2007, when advances in DNA technology allowed the state's crime laboratory to create a genetic profile from biological evidence found on Marais' jacket. For the first time in over 4 decades, investigators had scientific evidence that could potentially identify their suspect. However, when they ran the profile through criminal databases, no matches appeared. The DNA belonged to someone who had either never been arrested or had committed crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. In 2019, investigators partnered with Paraben Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. They uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to public genealogical databases, hoping to find distant relatives who might lead them to their target. The search produced a match to what appeared to be a very distant cousin, possibly as far removed as a 6th cousin. The following year brought an unexpected development when 18-year-old Eric Schubert, a history student at Elizabethtown College, contacted the Pennsylvania State Police. Schubert had developed expertise in genetic genealogy as a hobby and had previously helped other law enforcement agencies solve cold cases. When he read about Maris's story, he was deeply moved and offered his services free of charge. "I was just reading how heinous and how terrible of a crime it was," Schubert explained. "It just really struck me, and I knew if I could, I really wanted to help." The normally insular state police, desperate for a breakthrough, accepted his offer and began working closely with the determined young genealogist. For the next 2 years, Schubert worked tirelessly to build extensive family trees from the distant DNA match. He described the process as basically just a gigantic puzzle to put together, requiring him to trace family lines across multiple generations and geographic locations. The work was painstaking and complex, involving requests for additional DNA samples from family members and careful analysis of distant genetic connections. The investigation that went into all of this work was probably the hardest genealogy task that I've ever faced, Schubert said. "This was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life." But his determination never wavered. At a certain point, he became confident they were going to identify the person responsible. Gradually, the family trees Schubert constructed began to narrow the suspect pool. He provided investigators with names of relatives scattered across the country, most of whom cooperated by providing their own DNA samples for comparison. Through this process of elimination, the list of potential suspects was reduced to just 4 men. One name that emerged from this careful genealogical work was James Paul Forte, a man who had lived just 6 or 7 blocks from the Chivrella family in 1964. When investigators looked into Forte's background, they made a disturbing discovery. He had been arrested in 1974 on charges related to another incident involving a woman. This criminal history immediately elevated him to prime suspect status. James Paul Forte had been born in Hazleton in 1941 and lived in the town his entire life. Those who remembered him described him as tall, blue-eyed and handsome, but also as someone who largely kept to himself. His high school yearbook showed him only once, in his senior picture, with a brief description noting that he loved sports, especially baseball, and that his future was undecided. After graduating, Forte enlisted in the U.S. Army in October 1959 and was discharged in September 1962. Upon returning to civilian life, he worked as a bartender and bar supplies salesman in the Hazleton area. He never married and was not known to have had any children. The incident that brought Forte to police attention occurred on April 3, 1974, when a 23-year-old woman reported that he had attacked her inside his Chevrolet on Stockton Mountain Road in Hazle Township. When authorities served a search warrant on his vehicle, they found evidence linking it to the location where the assault had taken place. Forte was charged with multiple offenses, but ultimately accepted a plea deal and was convicted of aggravated assault on September 18, 1974. Judge Bernard C. Brominski sentenced him to 1 year of special probation, supervised by the Pennsylvania Probation and Parole Office, and ordered him to cover the woman's medical expenses. The relatively lenient sentence meant Forte remained free in the community. 4 years later, in 1978, Forte was arrested again on charges of reckless endangerment and harassment, though details of this incident were not preserved in court records. His pattern of concerning behavior continued, but he managed to avoid serious consequences that might have prevented future harm. Forte's life came to an end on May 16, 1980, when he suffered a heart attack while working at a ballroom in Hazle Township. He was just 38 years old, and his death meant he would never face justice for any crimes he may have committed. For nearly 4 decades, he lay buried while investigators continued searching for Maris's attacker, never knowing they were looking for someone who was already gone. When investigators identified Forte as their prime suspect in 2022, they faced a unique challenge: how to definitively prove a dead man's guilt. The solution required an extraordinary step: exhuming Forte's remains to obtain a direct DNA sample for comparison with the evidence from Maris's clothing. In January 2022, nearly 42 years after Forte's death, his body was exhumed from its resting place. Forensic experts carefully extracted tissue samples that could provide the definitive genetic comparison they needed. The samples were sent to the laboratory for analysis, and investigators waited anxiously for results that would either confirm their suspicions or send them back to square one. On February 3, 2022, the results arrived. The DNA profile from James Paul Forte's remains was a perfect match for the genetic material found on Marais Chivrella's jacket nearly 58 years earlier. Lieutenant Devon Brutowski would later explain the astronomical odds of such a match occurring by chance. In perspective, it's estimated that only 117 billion people have ever lived on Earth. To find another match to Mr. Forte, one would need to search over 4 million Earths. On February 10, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference to announce the resolution of what had become Pennsylvania's oldest cold case. The room was packed with current and retired investigators, including the original trooper who had first responded to Maris's case in 1964. Also present were Maris's 4 surviving siblings, Ron, Barry, Carmen Marie, and David, who had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator, became emotional as he addressed the gathering. He called it an important day not just for Maris's family, but for the entire Hazleton community that had been haunted by her death for nearly 6 decades. It's a vivid memory for everybody who lived through this, and it's a vivid memory for everybody who grew up in this area, he said. The announcement marked a significant milestone in forensic science as well. The case was believed to be the 4th oldest cold case in the United States to be solved using genetic genealogy, and the oldest ever resolved in Pennsylvania. It demonstrated the power of combining modern technology with traditional investigative techniques and the dedication of individuals like Eric Schubert, who volunteered their expertise for justice. For the Chivrella family, the news brought a complex mixture of emotions. Ron Chivrella spoke for his siblings when he said that we know the individual, it gives us a sense of closure. No full closure, we'll never have that. But a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it, and that the individual isn't out committing the same crime and hurting other young girls like Marais. Carmen Marie Rapp, Marais' sister, delivered an emotional statement that captured the family's enduring love and loss. We have so many precious memories of Marais. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. We will continue to ask ourselves, what would have been, what could have been? Remarkably, despite nearly 6 decades of anguish, the family's response reflected the values their parents had instilled in them. Rather than expressing hatred or desire for revenge, they spoke of justice and their hope that other families might be spared similar pain. Their parents, Carmen and Mary Chivrella, had died without ever learning who took their daughter's life, but they had raised their surviving children to focus on love and forgiveness rather than anger and retribution. The resolution of Marais' case also raised questions about whether Forte might have harmed other victims during the years between 1964 and his death in 1980. His pattern of concerning behavior, combined with the fact that he had remained free in the community despite his 1974 conviction, led investigators to suspect that Marais may not have been his only victim. Lieutenant Brutowski urged anyone with information about other unsolved cases to contact authorities. Eric Schubert, whose genealogical expertise had proved crucial to solving the case, reflected on the significance of finally being able to provide answers to the Chivrella family. What he did to her is irreversible, he said, but I think there's some closure in knowing that he's no longer alive and out there doing this to other girls. For the young genealogist, being part of the team that solved such an important case represented the culmination of years of dedicated work and a deep commitment to justice. The solving of Marais Chivrella's case demonstrated how persistence, advancing technology, and the dedication of individuals across multiple generations could finally bring resolution to even the most challenging mysteries. It showed that no case is ever truly hopeless, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through the combined efforts of law enforcement, scientists, and caring citizens who refuse to let victims be forgotten. For the people of Hazleton, the announcement marked the end of a shadow that had hung over their community for nearly 58 years. While nothing could bring back the innocent child who lost her life on that March morning in 1964, finally knowing the truth about what happened to her provided a measure of peace that had long been missing. The memory of Marais Anne Chivrella, the sweet, shy little girl who loved playing organ and dreamed of becoming a nun, will forever remain with those who loved her. Though her life was tragically cut short at just 9 years old, her story ultimately became a testament to the power of never giving up hope and the importance of seeking justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. The pain of her loss can never be erased, but the dedication of everyone who worked to find her attacker ensures that she will never be forgotten, and that her family finally has the answers they waited a lifetime to receive. The tragedy at the Cecil Hotel. Elissa Lamb was not supposed to become a household name. She was not supposed to become the subject of documentaries, conspiracy theories, and endless internet speculation. She was just a 21-year-old college student from Vancouver, British Columbia, who had a bright smile and dreams of writing. She was born on April 30, 1991, to David and Yinna Lamb, immigrants from Hong Kong who had built a new life in Canada. The Lamb family had worked hard to establish themselves in their new country. David and Yinna had opened a restaurant in Burnaby, British Columbia, and raised 2 daughters. Elissa was the younger child, and she shared a close relationship with her sister Sarah. Both girls loved fashion, and they would often seek each other out to discuss the latest trends and styles. The family lived together in Vancouver, where Elissa attended University Hills Secondary School before moving on to the University of British Columbia. But behind Elissa's outgoing personality and love of life, there was a struggle that her family kept private. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. Her medical records showed she had been prescribed several medications to help manage her condition, including bupropion, lamotrigine, quetiapine, dextroamphetamine, and venlafaxine. According to those who knew her, Elissa had no history of thoughts of taking her own life, though she had previously gone missing for brief periods during difficult episodes. Elissa had a complicated relationship with her prescribed medication. She had a history of not taking her bipolar medications consistently, and as a result, she sometimes suffered from episodes where she would experience intense fear and confusion. During these moments, she would sometimes hide under her bed, seeking refuge from what felt like threatening forces. She had been hospitalized at least once because of these episodes. Despite her struggles, Elissa was passionate about many things. She had started a blog called Ether Fields on Blogspot in 2010, where she shared her thoughts on fashion, life, and her ongoing battle with mental illness. In one particularly honest post from January 2012, she wrote about how a recent episode had forced her to drop several classes at university, leaving her feeling so utterly directionless and lost. She titled that post with a quote from novelist Chuck Palahniuk, "You're always haunted by the idea you're wasting your life." Later, Elissa moved her blogging to Tumblr, where she started a new page called Nouvelle Nouveau. The same Chuck Palahniuk quote appeared as the header, a reminder of her ongoing internal struggle. Through her writing, those who knew her could see both her creativity and her pain. In early 2013, even though she wasn't enrolled in classes at the university that term, Elissa decided she wanted to take a trip. She had never traveled alone before, but she felt ready for an adventure. She planned to explore the American West Coast, taking trains and buses to see cities she had only read about. Her parents, David and Yinna, were understandably worried about their daughter traveling alone, especially given her struggles with mental health. But Elissa was determined, and she promised to call them every single day. True to her word, Alyssa maintained daily contact with her family as she made her way south. She visited the San Diego Zoo and posted photos on social media, showing that she was enjoying her journey. She seemed happy and engaged with the world around her. On January 26, 2013, she arrived in Los Angeles and checked into the Cecil Hotel, also known as Stay on Main, located downtown near an area called Skid Row. The Cecil Hotel had a reputation that Alyssa may not have fully understood when she booked her room. Built in the 1920s, the hotel had become known for its troubled history and dangerous clientele. Located in a neighborhood struggling with serious social issues, including widespread homelessness and substance abuse, the Cecil had been home to several notable criminals over the years. Serial killer Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, had stayed there, as had Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger. Elizabeth Short, later known as the Black Dahlia victim, had also been a guest at the Cecil shortly before her tragic death. Initially, Alyssa was placed in a shared room on the hotel's 5th floor, but problems arose quickly. According to Amy Price, the hotel's manager at the time, Alyssa began leaving notes for her roommates that simply said, "Go home and go away." She would lock the door to their room and require a password for anyone to enter. Her behavior made her roommates so uncomfortable that the hotel staff decided to move her to a private room after just 2 days. Alyssa's unusual behavior wasn't limited to her interactions with roommates. A few days before she disappeared, she attended a live taping of Conan in Burbank, but security had to escort her off the premises because of disruptive behavior. Those who worked at the hotel began to notice that something seemed off about their young guest. Despite these warning signs, Alyssa continued her daily phone calls with her parents. Every day, without fail, she would check in with David and Yinna, telling them about her adventures and reassuring them that she was safe. This routine gave her family tremendous comfort, knowing that even though she was far from home, she was still connected to them. But on January 31, 2013, the phone didn't ring. That was the day Alyssa was supposed to check out of the Cecil Hotel and continue her journey to Santa Cruz. When her parents didn't hear from her, they immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like their daughter to break her promise, especially knowing how worried they were about her traveling alone. They called the Los Angeles Police Department that same day and reported their daughter missing. David and Yinna didn't wait for others to act. They flew from Vancouver to Los Angeles to help search for their daughter. The pain and fear they must have felt, being in a foreign city looking for their child, is difficult to imagine. Katie Orphan, the manager of the last bookstore, was one of the last people to see Alyssa alive on January 31st. She was outgoing, very lively, very friendly, Orphan later told CNN. Alyssa had been in the bookstore getting gifts to take home to her family, talking enthusiastically about her purchases and whether they would be too heavy to carry during her travels. It was a normal interaction, the kind that happens thousands of times a day in bookstores around the world. Katie had no way of knowing she was speaking to someone who would soon vanish without a trace. Hotel staff who saw Alyssa that day said she appeared to be alone. There was no indication of any distress, no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. But somewhere between that normal conversation at the bookstore and the next morning, Alyssa Lamb disappeared. The Los Angeles Police Department immediately began their investigation. Sergeant Ruddy Lopez and his team searched Lamb's hotel room and found her belongings still there, including her wallet, identification, and laptop. They brought search dogs through the Cecil Hotel, including the roof dog, but the dogs were unsuccessful in detecting her scent anywhere in the building. But we didn't search every room, Sergeant Lopez explained later. We could only do that if we had probable cause to believe a crime had been committed. Without evidence of foul play, there were legal limits to how extensively they could search a private business. Detective Tim Marsha, a homicide investigator with the lab, took charge of the case. After a week of searching with no results, the department decided they needed help from the public. On February 6th, they released flyers with Alyssa's photo. and posted them throughout the neighborhood and online. This brought the case to media attention, but still no leads materialized. On February 13th, investigators made a decision that would change everything about this case. They released approximately 2.5 minutes of security camera footage showing Alyssa in one of the hotel's elevators on January 31st, the last day she was seen alive. The footage showed behavior that was both puzzling and deeply disturbing. In the video, Alyssa enters the elevator and immediately begins pressing what appears to be every button in the middle row of the panel, leaning very close to see the numbers. She steps back into a corner as if hiding, then peers out into the hallway multiple times. She jumps out of the elevator in what seems like a playful manner, performs an odd stepping pattern, then returns to the elevator looking frustrated. But it was what happened next that captured the world's attention. Standing outside the elevator, Alyssa begins making exaggerated hand gestures, as if talking to someone, but no one else is visible in the frame. Her fingers are spread wide in an uncomfortable manner, and she appears to be counting off points as if giving reasons for something. Her movements are so unusual and unsettling that many viewers found the footage deeply disturbing. The video went viral almost immediately. It was posted on YouTube, shared across social media, and discussed on forums around the world. On the Chinese video sharing site Youku, it accumulated 3 million views and 40,000 comments in just 10 days. Many viewers found it so unsettling they had difficulty watching it completely. The footage sparked countless theories about what had happened to Alyssa. Some believed she was trying to escape from someone who was pursuing her. Others suggested she might have been under the influence of substances, though none would later be detected in her body. When her bipolar disorder became known publicly, many experts suggested the video showed someone having a psychotic episode. Internet investigators began analyzing every frame of the footage. Some claimed the video had been edited or tampered with, though police later confirmed this was the complete, unaltered recording. The timestamp had been obscured for privacy reasons, but no footage had been removed or manipulated. 6 days after the video was released, on February 19, 2013, hotel maintenance worker Santiago Lopez was investigating complaints from guests about low water pressure and strange taste in the tap water. Some guests later claimed their water was discolored and had an unusual smell. Lopez took the elevator to the 15th floor and climbed stairs to the hotel's roof to check the water tanks. The Cecil Hotel had 4 large water tanks, each holding 1,000 gallons, positioned on a platform on the roof. To reach them, Lopez had to turn off the rooftop alarm system, climb onto the platform, and then use a ladder to reach the top of the main tank. When he looked inside, he made a discovery that would stay with him forever. I noticed the hatch to the main water tank was open and looked inside and saw an Asian woman lying face up in the water approximately 12 inches from the top of the tank, Lopez later testified in court documents. He immediately called for help. Alyssa Lam had been found, but under circumstances so unusual they only deepened the mystery of what had happened to her. The tank had to be drained and cut open to recover her remains, as the maintenance hatch was too small for the equipment needed. She had been floating face up in the water that hotel guests had been drinking and bathing with for nearly 3 weeks. On February 20th, the day after Alyssa's discovery, health officials issued a do not drink order for the hotel water. Tests showed no dangerous bacteria that would cause immediate illness, but the psychological impact on guests who had unknowingly consumed the water was severe. 2 guests, Stephen and Gloria Cott, who had paid $150 for 2 nights at the hotel just days before Alyssa's body was found, filed a lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel. They sought their money back, compensation for potential future medical expenses, and unspecified damages. They also wanted to expand their lawsuit to include other affected guests in a class action suit. When the coroner's office performed the autopsy on February 21st, the findings were both conclusive and puzzling. The official cause of death was ruled accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. However, the full coroner's report released months later, revealed troubling details. Alyssa's body showed no evidence of physical trauma or assault. There were no signs that she had been harmed by another person. Toxicology tests revealed something crucial. The levels of her prescribed medications in her system were much lower than they should have been. When investigators checked her personal belongings, they found she had a large number of pills remaining in her prescription bottles, indicating she had not been taking her medication properly. When we went back and looked at all of the levels in the toxicology results, comparing those to the prescriptions that were found at the scene, it also suggests she was undertaking her medications, explained forensic pathologist Dr. Jason Tovar. This finding supported the theory that Alyssa may have been experiencing a manic or psychotic episode due to not taking her prescribed medication for bipolar disorder. But the question remained. How did Alyssa get into the water tank in the first place? Pedro Tovar, the Cecil's chief engineer, detailed the obstacles someone would face trying to reach the tanks. There were 4 ways to access the roof, 3 fire escapes accessible through interior doors, and 1 staircase from the 14th floor. An alarm system would sound if someone opened the door to the roof without first deactivating it, something typically only hotel employees knew how to do. The alarm was audible to the front desk and to guests on the 14th and 15th floors. Even if someone managed to reach the roof undetected, they would then have to climb onto the platform where the tanks sat, squeeze between the tanks and other plumbing equipment, climb another ladder to reach the top of one of the cisterns, and then open a heavy metal lid before entering the tank. According to investigators, each lid weighed approximately 20 pounds. Hotel manager Amy Price later wrote about the impossibility of escaping from inside the tank. I have thought 1 billion times about Alyssa Lamb going into the water tank and what it would have taken for her to get out, she wrote. Being a very good swimmer myself, I know it would have been nearly impossible. She would have to go all the way to the bottom, empty her lungs, and then spring up fast and shoot out of the water and grab the side of the open tank. There would not have been a ladder to grab, since the tank is not designed for people to be on the inside. Investigators believed that Alyssa had used the hotel's fire escape to reach the roof, possibly during a manic episode that caused her to act irrationally. They theorized that once she entered the water tank, she may have removed her clothing to prevent it from weighing her down, but ultimately became unable to escape. Her clothing was found floating in the tank, covered with a sand-like substance. The discovery of Alyssa's remains brought devastating news to her family in Vancouver. When Amy Price called to inform them, she later described the scene as heartbreaking. The pain she felt was palpable and horrible, and I felt so badly for her. Price wrote about Alyssa's mother falling to the ground and crying out upon hearing the news. I remember an attorney kneeled beside her and offered words of comfort. Alyssa's dad, meanwhile, was as still as a statue. It was one of those scenes that was very difficult to take in. I felt so sad for the Lambs. In September 2013, David and Yinna Lamb filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel. Through their attorney, Thomas Johnston, they argued that the hotel had failed to inspect and seek out hazards in the hotel that presented an unreasonable risk of danger to Alyssa and other hotel guests. They were seeking unspecified damages and burial costs. Johnston argued that Alyssa's mental illness should have been a factor the hotel considered. They should have secured that water tank. This was an accident waiting to happen, he told reporters. The family's position was that if the water tanks had been properly secured, their daughter might still be alive. The Cecil Hotel's legal team filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that they could not have reasonably foreseen that a guest might enter the water tanks. Hotel lawyers contended that since it remained unknown exactly how Alyssa was able to access the tanks, no liability could be assigned for failing to prevent it. They pointed out that the water tanks were located in an area where guests were not permitted, and that nothing similar had ever occurred in the hotel's history. In his court decision, Superior Court Judge Howard Helms sided with the hotel. He wrote, "In fact, the very nature of the water tank would make it unreasonable for Lamb to assume that she was allowed to climb it and open the lid. The judge found that the hotel could not have foreseen such an unusual accident occurring in an area where guests were prohibited. David and Yinna Lam's lawsuit was dismissed in 2015. While they initially filed an appeal, they later voluntarily dismissed their own appeal for reasons that were never made public. Some speculated it might have been part of a private settlement, but no such agreement was ever confirmed. The family's legal battle had come to an end, but their grief and questions remained. The strange circumstances surrounding Alyssa's death sparked numerous conspiracy theories and internet speculation. Web sleuths analyzed every frame of the elevator video, claiming to see evidence of foul play or supernatural activity. Some even targeted innocent people, including a death metal musician named Pablo Vergara, who had stayed at the Cecil Hotel a year before Alyssa's visit. He received death threats and required psychiatric hospitalization after being falsely accused by online investigators. Detective Tim Marsha, who had led the investigation, later stated firmly, "We have kind of a strange thing going on here, as there was nothing to support a crime of violence occurred. There was no physical evidence found." The official conclusion remained that Alyssa had suffered a mental health episode and accidentally drowned. Amy Price, who worked at the Cecil Hotel for a decade and was deeply involved in the case from the beginning, emphasized, "I couldn't have been more involved with the case from the beginning. I can say 100% in confidence that there is no conspiracy to Alyssa Lam's death. I know exactly in my mind what happened because I was there every step of the way. I worked with the police. I wish there was a little bit more focus on mental illness than the conspiracy theories." The case gained renewed international attention in 2021 when Netflix released a 4-part documentary series called Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. The series explored not only Alyssa's death, but also the dark history of the hotel itself and the impact of internet speculation on the case. But for David and Yinna Lam, no amount of media attention could bring back their daughter or provide the closure they sought. They had lost their youngest child under circumstances that, while officially explained, remained deeply painful to understand. Alyssa had been just 21 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, when her struggle with mental illness led to this tragic outcome. The loss of Alyssa Lam serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how serious mental health issues can be, especially when medication is not taken consistently. Her story has brought attention to bipolar disorder and the importance of proper treatment and support for those who suffer from it. For her family, she will always be remembered not as a mystery to be solved, but as a beloved daughter and sister whose life ended far too soon. The Last Light On, the story of Alexis Murphy. On the evening of August 3, 2013, 17-year-old Alexis Tiara Murphy left her Shipman, Virginia home with excitement in her voice and pink on her clothes. She lived with her mother, Laura Murphy, and her grandmother, Gail Taylor, in a close-knit household where Alexis was known as the bright light that filled every room. Her grandmother had always called Alexis a scared kind of person who never liked walking from the car to the house in the dark, so she would call several times on her way home to make sure someone was there to greet her. That night, as Alexis prepared to leave for Lynchburg to buy hair extensions for her senior pictures, her grandmother told her to take a house key, even though Alexis said she'd be home before 10:30 p.m. The grandmother left a light on for her granddaughter, as she always did. Alexis was a beautiful young woman who had just turned 17 that June. She was preparing for her senior year at Nelson County High School, where she served as co-captain of the volleyball team, the Nelson Lady Govs. Her friends and family described her as someone who lived in celebration, obsessed with social media, sports, fashion, and especially the color pink. She had recently received a raise at her job at Kid to Kid in Charlottesville and was looking forward to her senior year and graduation. Alexis was never without her iPhone 4, which had become like an extension of herself, and she was particularly excited about getting her senior photos taken, which explained her trip to Lynchburg that Saturday evening. Her mother, Laura Murphy, later described that final day with tears in her eyes during court testimony. "That was the last day I saw my daughter," she said, wearing a pink ribbon in honor of Alexis's favorite color. The family had no reason to worry that evening. Alexis was a responsible teenager who always stayed in touch, always called, and always came home when she said she would. When her grandmother woke up at 1:20 a.m. and saw that the light she had left on for Alexis was still burning, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The Murphy family alerted the Nelson County Sheriff's Office the next morning, explaining that this disappearance was completely out of character for their daughter. Within hours, a massive search effort began involving helicopters, search teams with canine units, and assistance from Nelson County Sheriff's Office, Virginia State Police, and the FBI. Alexis's school friends rallied to help create media attention, and within just 48 hours, her disappearance had gained national attention. Her aunt, Angela Taylor, described Alexis as a girly girl who had been actively looking at colleges and was excited about everything ahead of her. "For this to occur is just completely out of character for her," she told reporters. On August 6, 3 days after Alexis disappeared, her white 2003 Nissan Maxima was found abandoned in the parking lot of the Carmike Theater in Albemarle County. Surveillance footage showed the car arriving there around 10 p.m. on August 4, though the driver was not visible in the video. The discovery of her abandoned vehicle only deepened the family's fears and intensified the search efforts. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the Liberty gas station in Lovingston, where Alexis had been seen on the evening of August 3. The video showed a man holding the door for Alexis as she entered the store, and later footage revealed her white Nissan following his camouflaged suburban north on US Route 29, away from her intended destination of Lynchburg. The man was identified as 48-year-old Randy Allen Taylor, who lived in a camper on property near Lovingston. Employees at the Liberty gas station knew Taylor well, describing him as a regular customer who would buy Pall Mall red cigarettes and beer. More disturbing was their testimony about his behavior around teenage girls. Assistant manager Tammy Hitt testified that Taylor would gawk at the teenage girls who came into the station after school. Melissa Jarrell, who was working on August 3, said Taylor would sit there for hours watching everybody and described him as the last person you'd want to be alone with. Jarrell witnessed the interaction between Taylor and Alexis in the parking lot, testifying that she saw Alexis turn her head as if someone spoke to her. Then she walked over to his car and they talked. When investigators first questioned Taylor, he repeatedly denied ever seeing Murphy, being at the Liberty gas station that evening, or leaving his residence on August 4. But as evidence mounted against him, his story began to change dramatically. When confronted with proof that contradicted his denials, Taylor first claimed he had been buying marijuana that night from an unnamed friend who later drove him to Charlottesville. It wasn't until investigators presented him with DNA evidence proving that Alexis had been in his camper that Taylor finally admitted she had been there. FBI investigators Billy Mays and Janet Pittman spent 7 hours interviewing Taylor on August 11, 2013. During these recorded interviews, the investigators urged Taylor to think of his own son, who was 3 years younger than Alexis. "If this were your son, you'd want that person to tell," Mays said to Taylor during the interrogation. At that point, they revealed they had evidence that Alexis's phone had been on his property and that they had found one of her hairs proving she had been in his camper. Faced with this evidence, Taylor dramatically changed his story once again. He now claimed that Alexis had come to his camper with a black man with cornrows who was driving a maroon Chevrolet Caprice. According to Taylor's new version, this mysterious man had sold him marijuana, and all three had spent time in the camper before Alexis and the man left together. "We smoked a little weed," Taylor said on the recording. "I got some beer." The investigators expressed skepticism about Taylor's story, questioning why a drug dealer would come to the residence of someone he didn't know, and why Taylor, who had a surveillance camera on his camper, would leave Alexis and this stranger alone while he went to get beer. Despite Taylor's usual claims that he wasn't good with time, he was very specific about this detail, saying they were here for over an hour. Taylor was arrested that day after the 7-hour interview. Following his arrest, FBI investigators conducted a second search of his camper and discovered the Miller Lite t-shirt he had been wearing in the gas station surveillance video, balled up under the sofa. The shirt would later prove to contain crucial evidence linking him to Alexis's disappearance. The investigation revealed increasingly troubling details about what had happened to Alexis. FBI searches of Taylor's camper uncovered a strand of Alexis's hair, a damaged fingernail, and a diamond earring stud, all of which were matched to her through DNA analysis. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery of Alexis's DNA on Taylor's t-shirt, along with one of her hair extensions and a false eyelash. Special Agent Brittany Wampler, who participated in the search of Taylor's camper, later testified about the uncomfortable feeling she and other female FBI agents experienced during their interactions with Taylor. She described his very intense stare that made the agents uncomfortable, providing insight into the predatory behavior that gas station employees had also witnessed. Wampler also observed matted grass behind an abandoned house on the property where Taylor lived, with tire marks that looked like a vehicle low to the ground, unlike Taylor's larger SUV. Investigators later found grass and mud under Alexis's Nissan Maxima, suggesting it had been in that location. The most heartbreaking discovery was Alexis's iPhone, which was found by a canine officer in dense undergrowth about 70 feet from Taylor's camper. The phone had suffered extensive damage. The back was smashed off, the battery was missing, the battery cables were pulled out, and the processor was cracked, making it impossible to retrieve any information. FBI electronic engineer Dustin Simley testified that the last activity on the phone occurred at 7:36 p.m. on August 3, and then the phone went silent. When the damaged phone was shown to the jury, it was a moment that Alexis's Aunt Trina Murphy would later describe as emotional and disturbing. It was something Alexis kept with her all the time, she said. It clearly speaks to the fact she never left there. She never would have left without that phone. Additional evidence emerged about Taylor's movements after Alexis disappeared. Surveillance video from an armed forces recruiting station showed Alexis's Nissan arriving at the Carmack Theatre parking lot around 10 p.m. on August 4. Approximately 30 minutes later, Taylor appeared at a nearby Applebee's restaurant where bartender Jerry Madison Jr. testified that a sweating Taylor ordered 2 Heineken beers and requested a cab. Taylor told the bartender that his buddy was passed out outside, though Madison never saw anyone with him. Cab driver John Statt confirmed that he drove Taylor to Woods Mill, about 3 miles north of Taylor's camper, but also saw no companion. Earlier that same day, video evidence showed Taylor at an adult bookstore called Ultimate Bliss on Angus Road in Charlottesville at 5:21 p.m. on August 3, where he purchased 2 explicit videos. This timeline placed him in the area hours before his encounter with Alexis at the gas station. The man Taylor claimed had been with Alexis was identified as Damon Malcolm Bradley. When Bradley was located and questioned, he provided a completely different account. Bradley testified that he had moved to Birmingham, Alabama, shortly after Alexis disappeared, and was surprised when police contacted him because he didn't know her well, although he was dating her cousin. He explained that he had graduated in 2007, 7 years before Alexis would have graduated, and said their only connection was through Facebook. Most importantly, Bradley provided a solid alibi. He had spent the weekend of Alexis's disappearance in a motel in Madison Heights with his girlfriend, and the couple had no car that weekend. He categorically denied ever being in Taylor's camper or selling him marijuana. Randy Allen Taylor's trial began on May 1, 2014, in Nelson County Circuit, court under Judge Michael Gamble. The selection of the jury took about 8 hours, and Judge Gamble issued a gag order to prevent law enforcement officials, lawyers, and their employees from speaking publicly about the case. Taylor pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining his story about the mysterious third person. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth's attorney Anthony Martin, who faced the challenging task of proving murder without a body. In his 40-minute opening statement, Martin methodically laid out the physical evidence found in Taylor's camper. Alexis's DNA, her damaged nail, and hair with roots attached. He also connected Taylor to Alexis's abandoned car and detailed the timeline of events that night. Martin was attempting something extremely rare in Virginia criminal law, securing a murder conviction without the victim's body. Legal expert David Heilberg noted that such cases are few and far between, with the last similar local case being the 1983 conviction of Glenn Haslam Barker for the 1982 death of 12-year-old Katie Worski. Defense attorney Michael Hallahan argued that there was insufficient evidence for a conviction, telling the jury, "There's way too much reasonable doubt." Throughout the trial, Hallahan maintained that law enforcement had not fully investigated Taylor's claims about the third person and had focused predominantly on his client despite the alleged accomplice leaving the state shortly after Alexis disappeared. Hallahan also questioned how the T-shirt with Alexis's DNA had appeared in the camper after it had been thoroughly searched by the FBI, suggesting it had been planted. "What I submit is that Wednesday the shirt and hair weren't there," Hallahan argued. The trial featured emotional testimony from Alexis's family members. Her mother, Laura Murphy, took the stand wearing a pink ribbon and broke down several times while describing her daughter. She told the court about Alexis's excitement about her senior year, her job, and her plans for the future. Alexis's grandmother, Gail Taylor, testified about her granddaughter's excitement about buying hair extensions and her habit of always calling when she was on her way home. The prosecution called approximately 50 witnesses over 6 days of testimony. These included the gas station employees who described Taylor's predatory behavior, FBI agents who detailed the evidence found in his camper, and the bartender and cab driver who testified about Taylor's suspicious behavior after Alexis's disappearance. Cell phone expert Wendell Kosinzer explained the technical evidence showing that Alexis's phone had been in the vicinity of Taylor's camper before going silent. In his closing argument on May 7, 2014, Commonwealth's attorney Martin addressed the central question of the case. The biggest problem in Taylor's story, and it is a story, is that she left alone and was fine, Martin told the jury. Is it reasonable to leave without her hair extension, her nail, her DNA and cell phone? In a dramatic moment, Martin grabbed the stack of evidence envelopes containing Alexis's hair, damaged nail, diamond stud, broken cell phone, and Taylor's T-shirt. "This stuff doesn't lie," he declared. "DNA doesn't lie." He then silently opened one of the evidence bags, put on gloves, and held up Taylor's T-shirt and Alexis's hair extension before asking the jury, "No abduction, no murder." Defense attorney Hallahan made one final attempt to create reasonable doubt, even suggesting an alternative theory. What if someone paid him $10,000 to abduct and sell her overseas? He stressed that there was no definitive proof that Alexis was dead, and reminded the jury that they needed to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. "You may not like him, but that's not enough to convict him," Hallahan told the jurors. On May 8, 2014, after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The grim-looking jurors, who avoided making eye contact with Taylor, found him guilty on both charges. First-degree murder in the commission of an abduction and abduction with intent to defile. Some jurors were seen crying as the verdict was read around 4 p.m. that Thursday afternoon. This conviction marked only the third successful prosecution of murder without a body in Virginia state history. Immediately following the guilty verdict, the sentencing phase began. At this point, Taylor's attorney requested that his client be excused from the courtroom, and before the judge could respond, Taylor quickly rushed toward the exit door before being surrounded by deputies. He would not be present to hear the impact his actions had on Alexis's family. Laura Murphy took the stand during the sentencing phase, her voice breaking as she addressed the court. "It has been a living nightmare for us," she testified. "If Taylor were in my shoes, how would he feel?" She spoke about how her daughter had missed her most important year, her senior year in high school, and would not receive her diploma on May 17, just 9 days away. Laura broke down in sobs as she described the enormous hole Alexis's absence had left in their family. The jury took less than 30 minutes to recommend life sentences on both counts. Virginia had abolished parole in 1996, and the jury made it clear they never wanted Taylor to be released. The formal sentencing was scheduled for July 23, 2014. During the sentencing hearing in July, Taylor made one final attempt to negotiate. He claimed that a third person had been involved and offered to reveal the location of Alexis's remains in exchange for a reduced sentence of 20 years. However, both the prosecution and Alexis's family rejected this proposal. The family stated they were not willing to negotiate with someone who took the life of their daughter. On July 23, 2014, Taylor was formally sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse after the verdict, the emotions of Alexis's family were evident. Trina Murphy, Alexis's great-aunt and family spokesperson, described hearing the verdict as like winning the lottery and justice being served. However, she also acknowledged the bittersweet nature of the moment. "It doesn't bring us the closure that we need, but it goes a long way in helping us." When asked if they believed Taylor would ever confess to what he did with Alexis, family members said they prayed he would, but seriously doubted it would happen. Commonwealth's attorney Anthony Martin held a brief press conference after the sentencing, stating that the jury had put a dangerous man in jail. The conviction was particularly significant because Taylor had also been linked to the 2010 disappearance of 19-year-old Samantha Ann Clark in Orange County, Virginia. The night Clark was last seen, Taylor had contacted her by phone at least 5 times, and investigators were so convinced of his involvement that they had placed a GPS tracker on his car. Clark's body has never been found. For more than 7 years, Alexis Murphy's family lived without knowing where she was. Her aunt Angela Taylor described the ongoing pain of not having closure, of not being able to properly lay their loved one to rest. The family held vigils, continued to speak publicly about Alexis's case, and never gave up hope that they would someday find answers. That hope was finally fulfilled on December 3, 2020, when Alexis's remains were located on private property in Lovingston. Angela Taylor received the call from her sister that changed everything. They found Alexis. The discovery was so overwhelming that Angela had to pull over on Interstate 64 because she became physically ill. The remains were transporting to the Central District Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Richmond and were positively identified as Alexis Murphy on February 5, 2021. The family chose to keep this information private for 3 months before announcing it publicly on February 17, 2021, to give themselves time to grieve and make proper arrangements. Reports later indicated that Randy Taylor himself had led investigators to Alexis's remains, though he received no sentencing concessions for this assistance. After 7.5 years of maintaining his innocence and refusing to provide information about where Alexis could be found, Taylor finally guided authorities to her location. On June 5, 2021, what would have been Alexis's 25th birthday, her family held a celebration of life. Angela Taylor described it as a celebration of life and her, and to say thank you to law enforcement. Representatives from local police, state police, and the FBI all attended. To me, it was the perfect way to bring closure to this long, traumatic situation that so many in Nelson and across the country watched for 7 years, Angela said. 10 years after Alexis's disappearance, her family gathered again at the Liberty gas station in Lovingston for a vigil on the anniversary of that tragic night. Laura Murphy, still grieving but finding strength in community support, reflected on the bittersweet nature of their journey. "I'm feeling sad and happy at the same time," she said. Sad because we don't have her, but happy that 10 years, that we have all these people to still come out and remember her. She described how finding Alexis's remains had lifted a dark cloud, but couldn't clear the sky entirely. I have peace, but it's not a day that don't go by that I don't think of her. I'm at peace, but still not at peace. Through their unimaginable loss, the Murphy family found the strength to help others. They partnered with Help Save the Next Girl, founded by Gil Harrington, whose daughter Morgan had also been taken from her family. Gil Harrington sat with the Murphy family throughout Taylor's trial, wearing a bright pink shawl in honor of Alexis. The two mothers, bonded by their shared grief, worked together to give voice to other missing and lost loved ones. As Laura Murphy said in the organization's mission, Alexis was the next girl. The story of Alexis Murphy represents more than just one family's loss due to the actions of a predator. It stands as a testament to a young woman whose light was extinguished far too early, whose dreams of senior year and graduation were stolen, and whose family's love sustained them through the darkest imaginable circumstances. Alexis Murphy should have graduated from Nelson County High School on May 17, 2014. She should have gone to college, built a career, maybe had a family of her own. Instead, her life was cut short at 17 by Randy Allen Taylor, who will spend the rest of his life in prison for his actions that August evening. Though justice was served, and Alexis was finally brought home to rest in peace, the Murphy family continues to carry both their grief and their determination to ensure that Alexis's memory lives on as a force for protecting others. The Lost Promise of Joyce McLean. In the peaceful mill town of East Millinocket, Maine, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. Children played unsupervised in the parks, most residents kept their doors unlocked, and families trusted their neighbors. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the local high school was the center of community life, and where tragedy seemed impossible. For the McLean family, this sense of security was about to be shattered forever. Joyce McLean was just 16 years old in August 1980, but she had already become a shining example of what dedication and talent could achieve. She was an honor student at Schenck High School, preparing to enter her junior year that fall. Her academic excellence was matched only by her incredible musical abilities, which had been evident since she was a young child. Joyce played in the school orchestra, composed her own music, and served as president of the chorus. She was also secretary of her class, a member of the student council, part of the thespian group, the stage band, the tennis team, and the drama club. On top of all these accomplishments, she was a cheerleader who brought energy and spirit to every game. Joyce's mother, Pamela McLean, often marveled at how her daughter managed to balance so many activities while maintaining her grades and her kind, generous spirit. Joyce was popular and well-loved by her classmates, teachers, and everyone who knew her. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that could light up any room she entered. Her younger sister, Wendy, looked up to her as a role model, and Joyce took that responsibility seriously, always encouraging her sister and showing her the importance of working hard and treating others with respect. The McLean family lived a typical small-town life in East Millinocket. Pamela worked hard to provide for her daughters, and Joyce often helped by babysitting and giving piano lessons to younger children in the neighborhood. She had a natural gift for teaching and was patient with the little ones who struggled with the keys. Her musical talent was truly extraordinary, and many believed she had a bright future ahead of her, possibly pursuing music professionally after graduation. On Friday evening, August 8, 1980, Joyce was spending her day as she often did during the summer months. She had been babysitting and giving piano lessons earlier, earning a little money while helping local families. The weather was pleasant, and as evening approached, Joyce decided to go for her usual jog. She was athletic and enjoyed running, often choosing the route that took her past Schenck High School and around the athletic fields where she had cheered at so many games. Pamela McLean was sitting on the front steps of their home when Joyce prepared to leave for her run. It was between 7:0 and 7, 10 in the evening, and Joyce was wearing a pink, blue, and white terry cloth short and top set. As she crossed the street to begin her jog, Joyce turned back toward her mother with that familiar bright smile. "See you later, Mom," she called out. Those would be the last words Pamela McLean would ever hear her daughter speak. They were simple, everyday words that carried no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold. For Pamela, those 4 words would echo in her memory for nearly 4 decades. As Joyce jogged toward the school athletic fields, she was following a route she had taken many times before. The soccer field was a popular hangout spot for local teenagers, especially on Friday evenings. Some young people would gather there to socialize, and it was generally considered a safe area. Joyce had no reason to feel concerned as she approached the familiar grounds where she had spent so many happy hours as a student and cheerleader. Unknown to Joyce, 19-year-old Philip Scott Fournier had been watching her. Fournier was known around town as someone who often hung around the school athletic yards, and according to later testimony, he had expressed interest in getting to know the popular teenage girl. On this particular evening, his presence near the school would prove to have devastating consequences. When Joyce failed to return home that evening, Pamela McLean felt the first stirrings of worry. Joyce was responsible and always kept her parents informed of her whereabouts. As the hours passed, and there was still no sign of her daughter, Pamela's concern grew into genuine fear. She searched for Joyce herself, walking the routes her daughter usually took and calling out her name into the gathering darkness. Early Saturday morning, August 9, Pamela contacted family members, and they organized search efforts throughout the area. Her brother and other relatives scoured the town, checking with Joyce's friends and anyone who might have seen her. As Saturday turned into Sunday with no word, the family made the difficult decision to contact the East Millinocket Police Department to report Joyce as missing. On Sunday morning, August 10, 1980, Pamela McLean saw East Millinocket Police Chief approaching her house. The moment she spotted him walking up the pathway, she knew something terrible had happened. The look on his face, the way he carried himself, everything about his demeanor told her that the news would be devastating. "When I saw him coming up the walk, I knew it was bad news," she later testified. "I asked him if they'd found Joyce, and he nodded his head yes. I asked him, dead. He nodded his head yes again. When I asked him, killed, he said yes." Joyce McLean's remains had been discovered at approximately 6 that morning behind the athletic fields of Schenck High School. Peter Lally, one of the volunteers who had been searching for the missing teenager, made the heartbreaking discovery. Joyce's clothing was in disarray, and she had suffered fatal injuries. Investigators determined she had been harmed in a violent way, and her hands had been bound with a piece of cloth. The scene was difficult for investigators who responded. Heavy rains overnight had washed away much of the potential evidence, making the investigation more challenging. No fingerprints were found at the scene, and no identifiable DNA was recovered from Joyce's clothing. Despite the lack of physical evidence, it was clear that this was an intentional act of violence against an innocent young girl. The impact of Joyce's loss on the community was immediate and profound. East Millinocket, a place known for its friendliness and trust, suddenly became suspicious and fearful. Residents who had never locked their doors began securing their homes. Parents who had allowed their children to play freely now kept them close. The sense of safety that had defined this small mill town was gone, replaced by doubt and fear that infected relationships and turned neighbors into potential suspects. For Pamela McLean and her surviving daughter Wendy, the loss was beyond comprehension. The house that had once been filled with Joyce's music, her laughter, and her vibrant energy was now silent. There would be no more piano lessons, no more cheerleading practice, no more dreams of a bright future. Wendy had lost her big sister and role model, while Pamela faced the unimaginable pain of burying her child. Almost immediately, Philip Scott Fournier became a person of interest in the investigation. On August 9, 1980, just hours after Joyce was last seen alive, Fournier had burglarized a local garage and stolen a fuel truck at approximately 3 in the morning. He crashed the stolen vehicle into a passenger car less than a mile away in the neighboring town of Medway, suffering a head injury in the accident. When questioned about his erratic behavior, Fournier later admitted that he had intended to take his own life. The timing of Fournier's actions raised immediate suspicions among investigators. His decision to steal a truck and attempt what appeared to be a form of self-harm just hours after Joyce disappeared seemed more than coincidental. However, without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, police could not make an arrest based solely on suspicious timing and behavior. In May 1981, 9 months after Joyce's tragic loss, Fournier made what would become the first of several confessions. He contacted Reverend Vinyl Thomas, the pastor at Calvary Temple Assemblies of God in East Millinocket. Both Fournier and Joyce had attended the church's youth group, so the minister knew them both personally. Thomas had even presided over Joyce's funeral service, making what happened next even more shocking. Fournier called the minister and asked to meet at the church office. When he arrived, Reverend Thomas could see that the young man was deeply distressed. He seemed upset because he was wringing his hands and looked like he'd been crying, Thomas later testified. He described Fournier's demeanor as nervous. What Fournier said next left the minister stunned. He told me, "I harmed Joyce McLean," Thomas testified. When the minister asked for details, Fournier explained that he had struck her in the head. The minister asked if there had been any inappropriate contact, and Fournier replied, "No, it was the wrong time of the month." This detail was particularly significant because investigators had determined that Joyce was on her period when she lost her life. Reverend Thomas found the confession difficult to believe. "I said, 'I think you're a liar,'" he testified. Fournier, desperate to be believed, asked what he could do to prove he was telling the truth. The minister told him to call his mother and stepfather, have them come to the church, and repeat his confession without any variations. When Anita and Wayne Powers, Fournier's mother and stepfather, arrived at the church office, Fournier told them, "I took Joyce's life, but I didn't mean to." Both witnessed him crying as he made this admission. The three adults were deeply concerned about what they had heard, and they were also worried about Fournier's safety if word of his confession spread throughout the small community. They decided to take Fournier to the Bangor police station so he could speak with investigators. Reverend Thomas drove, and they waited outside while Fournier went in to speak with detectives. After 45 minutes to an hour, Fournier emerged from the police station and got back in the car. He said, "They don't believe me. I must have said something wrong," the minister later testified. Retired state police detective Ronald Grave, who interviewed Fournier that day, explained that he did not arrest him because what Fournier said did not match the evidence they had gathered. There were inconsistencies in his account that raised questions about the reliability of his statements. When they returned to East Millinocket, Wayne and Anita Powers were surprised that Fournier had not been arrested. He came in the house and said, "I didn't do it, Mama," his mother testified. "I was surprised to see him and very happy." For 8 years, the case remained unsolved, though Fournier continued to be a person of interest. Then, in June 1989, he made another confession, this time to a co-worker. Fournier was working as a janitor at what was then Husson College in Bangor when Supervisor John DeRoche learned that Fournier lived in East Millinocket. DeRoche asked Fournier about Joyce's case, and the response was shocking. "I asked him if he knew about Joyce's case, and he said, 'I took her life. I know all about it,'" DeRoche testified. When asked for details, Fournier said, "I hit her with a glass insulator on the back of the head." This detail was significant because a broken insulator had indeed been found near Joyce's remains. A few days later, DeRoche asked Fournier why he had never been arrested. He said that he'd been interviewed 20 times or more, and he'd beat all the interviews, DeRoche testified. The janitor reported this conversation to Husson Security in 1989, but it would be many more years before any action was taken. Throughout the years that followed, the investigation continued, but progress was slow. Pamela McLean never gave up hope that her daughter's case would be solved. She pushed officials to keep investigating, wrote letters asking the state attorney general to take over the case, and did everything in her power to keep Joyce's memory alive. The case gained national attention, being featured on NBC's Unsolved Mysteries in 1989 and in People magazine in 2009. The breakthrough finally came in 2008 when detectives began investigating the cold case as if it were entirely new. They re-examined every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and applied new investigative techniques. On March 4, 2016, nearly 36 years after Joyce lost her life, Philip Scott Fournier was finally arrested and charged with her case. Fournier, now 57 years old, was held at the Penobscot County Jail, unable to post $300,000 bail. He had been interviewed by police 27 times over the course of the 35-year investigation. The decision to finally arrest him was based on the accumulation of his multiple confessions and his knowledge of details about the crime that had never been made public. The trial began on January 22, 2018, nearly 38 years after Joyce's loss. Fournier waived his right to a jury trial, leaving his fate in the hands of Superior Court Justice Anne Murray. Pamela McLean, now an elderly woman who had waited decades for this moment, took the stand to describe the last time she saw her daughter alive. During the trial, the prosecution presented testimony from Reverend Vinyl Thomas, Wayne and Anita Powers, and John DeRoche, all of whom testified about Fournier's confessions over the years. Assistant Attorney General Lean Zania urged the judge to believe these multiple admissions, arguing that they were consistent and contained details that only the perpetrator would know. The defense team, led by attorney Jeffrey Silverstein, argued that Fournier's confessions were unreliable due to the traumatic brain injury he had suffered in the truck crash hours after Joyce disappeared. They claimed that his statements were the result of confusion between his own memories, things he had been told, and dreams. Defense witness Dr. Robert Riley, a clinical neuropsychologist, testified about how traumatic brain injuries could affect memory and lead to false confessions. However, Justice Murray was not convinced by the defense arguments. In her verdict, delivered on February 22, 2018, she noted that Fournier had demonstrated the ability to recall other events with great clarity, suggesting that his memory was not as compromised as the defense claimed. More importantly, she pointed to specific details that Fournier had provided that were not publicly known. His recitation that Joyce had an injury to the left side of her face, yet the left side of her face was not visible when she was found, and Mr. Fournier's attempt to take his own life in the oil truck within hours of Joyce McLean's loss causes the court to find that the state has proven the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, Justice Murray said. The courtroom was packed as Justice Murray announced her verdict. Philip Scott Fournier was guilty of taking the life of Joyce McLean. For Pamela McLean, who had waited 37.5 years for this moment, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued sorrow. It took 37.5 years, and you'll never see a happier mother than this one is right here, right now, today, she said after the verdict was announced. However, the happiness was complicated by the reality that no verdict could bring Joyce back or restore the years of pain and uncertainty the family had endured. On April 26, 2018, Fournier returned to court for sentencing. Pamela McLean was too ill to attend in person, but victim witness advocate Renee Ordway read her impact statement. For the last 38 years Joyce has been gone, and Scott has had his freedom, while I spent most of them seeking justice for Joyce, the statement read. He not only took our Joyce's life, but he took a big part of Wendy. There was no more music, no more laughter in our house. Justice Murray sentenced Fournier to 45 years in prison, calling his actions a cruel and violent act. The judge also found that the motive for Joyce's loss was related to intended assault, although evidence showed that such an assault had not occurred. Fournier, who maintained his innocence even at sentencing, told the court, "What happened to Joyce was a horrible thing. From what I heard, she was a wonderful person. That should not happen to anybody else." The sentence meant that Fournier who was 57 at the time, would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Under Maine law at the time of the crime, he could potentially earn 1/3 off his sentence for good behavior, but even with that reduction, he would serve into his 80s. For the McLean family and the community of East Millinocket, the conclusion of the case brought a sense of closure, but it could never fully heal the wounds that Joyce's loss had created. The vibrant, talented teenager who had brought so much joy and music to her family and community was gone forever, her promising future cut short by an act of senseless violence. Joyce McLean's story serves as a reminder of the precious nature of life and the devastating impact that violence can have on families and communities. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, and her legacy continues to inspire calls for justice and protection for all young people who deserve the chance to pursue their dreams and reach their full potential.
The case of Clea Tiltman. Clea Tiltman was 16 years old when she lost her life on a cold January evening in 1993, just 4 days after celebrating her birthday. She was the only child of Linda and Cliff Tiltman, who had raised her with love in the quiet Hans Cross area of Stone, near Greenhithe in Dartford, Kent. Her parents cherished their bright, ambitious daughter who attended Dartford Grammar School for Girls, where her friends affectionately called her Tilts. She was someone who drew people to her naturally, with what the judge would later describe as an engaging and lively personality that made her extremely popular with a wide circle of friends. Clea had just completed her mock GCSE exams and was in year 11, regularly discussing college plans and her future with classmates. She was deeply involved in the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, working toward her bronze award through activities at the local Dartford fire station. Her dream was to become a firefighter, a goal that reflected her caring nature and desire to help others. Her school friends remembered her as beautiful and loyal with a wicked sense of humor, someone who was funny and ambitious and brought light to every room she entered. These were the qualities that made Clea special to everyone who knew her, from her devoted parents to the many friends who would later form the Justice for Clea campaign to keep her memory alive. The Tiltman family belonged to the local British Legion Club, a community gathering place where they had built friendships over the years. It was through this connection that they knew another family, the Ash Smiths, who also attended club events regularly. Colin Ash Smith was 8 years older than Clea, 24 at the time, and lived with his parents on Milton Street in nearby Swanscombe. He occasionally played pool with Clea during family visits to the club, creating what seemed like a harmless acquaintance between their families. No one could have imagined that this familiar face would later be linked to such devastating events. On the evening of January 18, 1993, Clea left her family home to visit a friend, taking what should have been a simple, safe walk through her neighborhood. It was just after 6:20 p.m. when she entered a dark alleyway that served as a shortcut off the A226 London Road, close to her home in Greenhithe. This pathway was one she had used many times before, a routine part of moving through her familiar community. But on this night, someone was waiting in the shadows, someone who had been planning something harmful. What happened next changed everything for the Tiltman family and the entire Dartford community. Clea was subjected to a violent attack, harmed repeatedly by someone who struck from behind. Passers-by discovered her shortly after the incident began and immediately tried to help, but despite their efforts and the quick arrival of emergency services, Clea did not survive. She had been targeted in what prosecutors would later describe as a savage and brutal act of violence by someone who took pleasure in causing harm. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, involving hundreds of officers and thousands of tips from the public. Clea's photograph appeared on front pages across the nation as police appealed for any information that might lead to her attacker. Her parents, Linda and Cliff, kept the case in the public eye for years, never giving up hope that justice would eventually come. They attended press conferences, spoke to reporters, and maintained their belief that someone in their community knew who had taken their daughter's life. The pain in their voices was evident when they spoke at Clea's funeral, with Linda saying, "You look around and you hope that it's someone you don't know, but we don't know. That person could have been there. I hope that they weren't. I'll never ever forgive that person for whatever reason. That person's got to be caught." Despite the intensive initial investigation, the case went cold for nearly 2 decades. Colin Ash Smith attended Clea's funeral, standing among the mourners as her family and friends said their final goodbyes. He continued living in the same area, working as a milkman, while carrying the secret of what he had done. But his violent tendencies didn't end with Clea's loss. In 1995, just 2 years later, he attacked another young woman, Charlotte Barnard, in the same area of Greenhithe. Charlotte was harmed many times but miraculously survived. When Ash Smith was eventually caught and convicted for this attack, police found evidence that connected him to an even earlier crime from 1988. The breakthrough that would finally bring justice for Clea came through an unexpected source. While serving time in prison for his other attacks, Ash Smith befriended a fellow prisoner named Paul Dubois. During their conversations, Ash Smith began sharing details about his violent acts, perhaps feeling safe in the environment of criminals around him. He specifically mentioned attacking someone he had seen using a zebra crossing, providing details that would prove crucial to investigators when the case was reopened. This confession, combined with modern forensic techniques and changes in legal procedures that allowed evidence of previous crimes to be presented in court, would finally give prosecutors the tools they needed. In 2010, the Kent Police Cold Case Unit received special funding to re-examine Clea's case using advanced forensic methods that hadn't been available in 1993. The investigation team, led by Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson from the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate Cold Case Team, worked methodically through old evidence and new leads. On the 19th anniversary of Clea's loss in April 2012, her father Cliff made another public plea for information, still hoping for answers after nearly 2 decades of waiting. The Justice for Clea campaign, formed by her high school friends, organized memorial events including a candlelit walk in January 2013 that retraced Clea's final steps. These efforts kept pressure on authorities and ensured that Clea's case remained in public consciousness. When Colin Ash Smith was finally arrested and charged with Clea's death, he was already serving 3 life sentences for his attacks on other women. The evidence against him included not only the prison confession, but also details about his distinctive white Ford Capri, which witnesses had seen in the area. Police found that he had given a false alibi for the night of Clea's loss, making a deliberately timed phone call to create the appearance that he was elsewhere. Most damaging were his own detailed writings, which he called plans, documenting his attacks and plotting future violence. The trial took place at Inner London Crown Court in Southwark in late 2014, more than 21 years after Clea lost her life. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC described Ash Smith as a ruthless predatory offender who took pleasure in violence. The Crown's case painted a picture of a man who had planned Clea's loss carefully, choosing her as a vulnerable target. Evidence was presented about Ash Smith's previous convictions, his collection of dangerous objects, and his habit of taking midnight walks, while carrying items capable of causing harm and looking for people to attack. Taking the witness stand in his own defense, Ash Smith admitted to being an animal when describing his previous attacks. He testified about his obsession with women and his hatred toward them, explaining that he feared their power over him. "I didn't like them because I felt they had power over me," he told the court. "My own perception of them was I couldn't trust them because they used me. I felt worthless, low self-esteem, and I had no confidence around other people. I wasn't happy around most people." He admitted to keeping a stash of dangerous objects and writing detailed accounts of his attacks. However, despite these admissions about his other crimes, he insisted that he had not taken Clea's life. The defense team attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case by suggesting that serial offender Robert Napper, who had taken the lives of multiple women in London during the same time period, might have been responsible for Clea's death. They also tried to discredit the prison confession and argued that there was no direct physical evidence linking Ash Smith to the scene. But the prosecution had built a comprehensive case that included not only the confession, but also the pattern of Ash Smith's behavior, his false alibi, and his access to Clea through their family connection at the British Legion Club. The judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, made a significant legal decision by allowing evidence of Ash Smith's previous crimes to be presented to the jury. This was one of the earliest high-profile applications of the 2003 Criminal Justice Act's provisions in London, marking an important precedent for future cases. The jurors heard extensive testimony about Ash Smith's 1988 and 1995 convictions and listened to readings from his detailed plans. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who derived satisfaction from causing serious harm to vulnerable women. After 5 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury took just 3 hours to reach their verdict. On December 11, 2014, Colin Ashsmith was found guilty of taking Clea Tiltman's life. About a dozen of Clea's school friends were present in the gallery to hear the decision, many breaking down in tears as justice was finally served. Ashsmith stared straight ahead as the verdict was read, showing no visible emotion. The following day, December 12, 2014, Mr. Justice Sweeney delivered the sentence. Ashsmith was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. The judge explained that under the old sentencing guidelines, this was roughly equivalent to what he would have received if the case had been prosecuted in 1993. I have no doubt that this was a premeditated act that you carried out because of the feeling of power that it gave you, Justice Sweeney told Ashsmith. In so doing, you not only ended Clea's young life, which was so full of promise, but you also caused unbearable grief and upset to her family and friends. Ashsmith, who was 46 at the time of sentencing, reacted impassively as the life term was imposed. He was not present in court for the sentencing hearing. Justice Sweeney praised the Kent police for their dedication in bringing Clea's case to trial and commended the members of Clea's family and friends who had attended the proceedings. I would also like to commend the members of Clea's family and her friends who have attended this trial for the dignified way in which they have conducted themselves, the judge said. And I express my sorrow for the burden they have had to carry for many years at Clea's untimely loss. Following the conviction, Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson spoke about the impact of the case, describing Ashsmith as an evil and predatory man who had snatched her life away. It should have been a day like any other, he said. Then on that day, Ashsmith has not only taken her life, taken her future as well, and destroyed the lives of her family and friends. Jaswant Nawal, CPS Southeast Chief Crown Prosecutor, called it one of the most complex cases that CPS Southeast had dealt with in recent years. In November 2015, Ashsmith attempted to appeal his conviction, arguing that Justice Sweeney had wrongly allowed gravely prejudicial material to be presented to the jury. However, his appeal was rejected by Lord Justice Davis and 2 other Lords Justice of Appeal, who declared his case unarguable. He remains imprisoned at HMP Durham, serving his sentence for taking Clea's life along with his previous convictions. Tragically, both Linda and Cliff Tiltman passed away before they could see their daughter's case resolved. They had spent years believing that Colin Ashsmith was responsible for Clea's death, but they never lived to see him held accountable. Their unwavering dedication to seeking justice for their only child kept the case alive in public memory and contributed to the eventual breakthrough that led to the conviction. The loss of these devoted parents, who carried the burden of their grief for over 2 decades, adds another layer of heartbreak to this already devastating story. Clea Tiltman's story represents both the worst of human nature and the best of community resilience. Her life, though cut tragically short, touched countless people who refused to let her memory fade away. The dedication of her friends, the persistence of law enforcement, and the love of her parents ensured that justice eventually prevailed, even though it came far too late for those who loved her most.
The murder of Fawn Marie Cox. In the summer of 1989, 16-year-old Fawn Marie Cox was living a typical teenage life in Kansas City, Missouri. She shared a home near 9th and Van Brunt with her parents and her younger sister Felicia. The Cox family was close-knit, and Fawn was known for her bright spirit and dedication to her work at Worlds of Fun, the local amusement park. She was the kind of daughter who came home tired from late shifts but always looked forward to the next day. On the evening of July 26, 1989, Fawn returned home from her job at Worlds of Fun around 11 p.m. It had been another long shift, but she was already thinking about returning to work the next morning. That night was particularly hot and humid, making the second-floor bedroom she normally shared with her younger sister Felicia uncomfortable. The family had made adjustments to stay cool, with the parents sleeping downstairs where their working air conditioner provided relief from the oppressive heat. Felicia had also chosen to sleep on the first floor that night, leaving Fawn alone in the upstairs bedroom. Her younger sister Amber was not home that evening, as she had been hired to babysit for someone nearby. Fawn climbed the stairs to her second-floor bedroom, knowing she needed a good night's rest before another day of work. She settled into bed in the room that offered her privacy, but also, unknowingly, made her vulnerable. The family's decision to sleep downstairs due to the heat would prove to be a tragic circumstance that no one could have foreseen. While the Cox family slept peacefully on the first floor, someone with intimate knowledge of their home and routines was preparing to commit an unthinkable act. The perpetrator knew exactly where Fawn's bedroom was located and understood how to access the second-story window without detection. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity, but rather a calculated act by someone who had been to the house before and was familiar with the family's living arrangements. In the early hours of July 27, 1989, someone climbed up to Fawn's second-story bedroom window and broke inside. The family dog had been agitated during the night, but this was dismissed because the animal was pregnant. The air conditioning units running throughout the house masked any sounds that might have alerted the family to the tragedy taking place upstairs. Fawn was attacked and lost her life due to the actions of her intruder, who left behind evidence that would remain a mystery for more than 3 decades. When morning came on July 27, Fawn's alarm clock began ringing at 9 a.m., signaling it was time for her to get ready for another shift at Worlds of Fun. But the alarm continued to sound, and Fawn didn't turn it off as she normally would. Her mother and younger sister Felicia went upstairs to investigate why Fawn wasn't responding to her alarm. What they discovered in that bedroom would haunt them forever. Fawn was lying motionless on her bed, and there were clear signs that she had been harmed. I went over to shake her. "Come on, get up." But she had been gone for a while, Felicia Cox later remembered. The family immediately called for an ambulance, but it was clear that Fawn had passed away hours earlier. Medical professionals who examined her determined that she had lost her life due to strangulation and had been attacked by her assailant. The Kansas City Police Department immediately launched an investigation into what they recognized as a deeply disturbing crime. This one touched a lot of people, because she was an innocent child who lost her life in her own bed, said Captain Ben Caldwell, who later served as supervisor of the missing persons cold case section. It rattled detectives and officers who worked it for decades. The crime scene investigators collected crucial evidence, including DNA material that would prove to be the key to solving the case more than 30 years later. Initially, the investigation focused on 2 teenage suspects who were charged in connection with Fawn's death. These young men had some connection to the Cox family and seemed to have knowledge of the house's layout. However, the case against them quickly fell apart when the key witness recanted their statement and admitted to being untruthful. The charges against the juveniles were dropped, leaving detectives without clear suspects and a grieving family without answers. The initial detectives worked the case into the ground, Captain Caldwell later recalled, running down every possible lead. In 1989, the technology available to analyze the biological evidence was extremely limited. Crime scene investigators had collected DNA material from the scene, but all they could do at the time was attempt to compare blood types. The evidence was carefully preserved, though no one realized just how valuable it would become decades later. As the years passed, the Cox family never gave up hope that Fawn's case would be solved. They remained in contact with detectives and provided any assistance they could to the ongoing investigation. Both of Fawn's parents continued to live with the pain of their daughter's unsolved case, always wondering who had been responsible for taking her life. In the first decade of the 2000s, advances in DNA technology allowed KCPD crime lab scientists to develop a suspect DNA profile from the preserved material collected since 1989. They uploaded this profile to the National CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, database, the criminal justice DNA database used across the country. Despite their hopes, there was no match in the system. KCPD detectives continued to explore any possible leads as the years went on. As recently as 2 years before the case was finally solved, they re-interviewed the former juvenile suspects, who had initially been charged, and obtained DNA samples from them. Those samples didn't match the DNA profile from the crime scene either, confirming that the original suspects had been wrongly accused. The breakthrough in Fawn's case came during the summer of 2020, when Operation Legend brought federal resources to Kansas City to help solve violent crimes. Detectives identified Cox's case as a candidate for a cutting-edge type of DNA identification called genealogical DNA testing. This technology allows law enforcement to compare an unknown suspect's DNA profile to public genealogical databases and build a family tree, creating a small pool of potential suspects. The technique had already proven successful in solving high-profile cold cases like that of the Golden State serial killer in California. Captain Caldwell had known that Cox's case could likely be solved with this technology, but there had been significant barriers involving cost, protocol, and manpower. The federal resources and expertise that came with Operation Legend finally overcame those hurdles. The FBI even covered the cost of the expensive testing, as it was beyond KCPD's budget. Using the genealogical DNA results, detectives narrowed their focus to a suspect who was both shocking and tragically familiar to the Cox family. The DNA evidence pointed to Fawn's own cousin, Donald Cox Jr., who was about 5 years older than her. Donald had passed away in 2006, but under circumstances that had raised enough suspicion for the medical examiner to investigate and retain a blood sample. Crime lab staff extracted DNA from Donald's preserved blood sample and compared it to the DNA profile from the material recovered at the original crime scene in 1989. The results were conclusive. It was a match. After more than 30 years, the person responsible for Fawn's death had been identified, and it was someone the family had known and trusted. On November 10, 2020, detectives informed Fawn's family of the stunning news. Both of her parents were still living, and Captain Caldwell said they were sad, but relieved to finally have answers. In a heartbreaking revelation, they told detectives that they had sometimes wondered whether Donald could have been responsible for their daughter's death. "It's a relief there's closure," said Felicia Cox, Fawn's sister, when the news was announced. "The answers aren't always what we were asking for, but there's closure." The revelation that the perpetrator was a relative made the discovery particularly difficult for the family to process. The fact that it's someone that you know well and it's actually a relative, how is the family dealing with that? A reporter asked. "I think we're doing okay. We're doing okay. Just having answers helps," Felicia responded. The family had always suspected that Fawn's attacker was someone known to her, which explained how he was able to access her bedroom window without detection, and why Fawn never called for help during the attack. Donald had been a frequent visitor to the Cox home, giving him intimate knowledge of the house's layout and the family's routines. This familiarity had allowed him to commit his crime and escape undetected while the rest of the family slept downstairs. The revelation about Donald's involvement raised questions about whether he had acted alone or if others had been present that night. Some evidence suggested that the original juvenile suspects may have been in the house during the evening hours when the crime occurred. However, no further charges were brought against anyone else, and law enforcement concluded their investigation. Felicia Cox stated that it would be of no use to pursue confessions from the original suspects, suggesting that Donald may have acted alone at the crucial moment. The original suspicion against the juvenile suspects had stemmed from a Nintendo gaming system that had been reported stolen from Fawn's home and was later found among the belongings of one of the young men. This had led police to initially focus on them as the primary suspects. However, the DNA evidence definitively proved that Donald Cox Jr. was responsible for the most serious aspects of the crime. Donald Cox Jr. had lived with the secret of his crime for 17 years after Fawn's death, maintaining contact with his family and appearing to live a normal life. However, his struggles with substance use eventually led to his own demise in 2006, when he passed away due to an overdose. His death meant that he would never face justice in a courtroom for what he had done to his young cousin. The case officially closed with Donald's identification as the perpetrator, but there would be no trial, no sentencing, and no opportunity for the family to confront their daughter's attacker. Somebody's out there living a normal life that she never got to live. She never got to grow up and do the things that we're doing now, one family member had said before the case was solved, expressing the frustration of decades without answers. Captain Caldwell noted that genealogical DNA testing could be a tremendous tool for solving cold cases, but the cost and manpower involved remained significant barriers for many police departments. He expressed hope that sustainable funding could be established to bring this technology to more unsolved cases, potentially bringing justice to other families who had been denied answers for years. For the Cox family, the resolution of Fawn's case brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. After 31 years of wondering who had taken their daughter's life, they finally had the truth, even though it was more painful than they had imagined. The knowledge that someone they had known and trusted could commit such an act against 16-year-old Fawn was devastating, but it also provided the closure they had sought for so many years. The murder of Fawn Marie Cox stands as a reminder of how advances in forensic science can bring justice even decades after a crime has been committed. It also highlights the importance of preserving evidence and never giving up on cases that seem unsolvable. While Fawn never received the justice of seeing her attacker face trial, her family finally received the answers they had fought so hard to obtain. The case serves as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who never forgot about Fawn Cox, even as decades passed without resolution. Their commitment to her memory and their persistence in seeking justice ultimately led to the identification of her killer, providing her family with the closure they desperately needed after more than 3 decades of pain and uncertainty.